Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, and today I want to talk about something just maybe a little bit more fun than usual. I want to talk about genres of fantasy and science fiction or sci-fi, and I want to talk about their prevalence and maybe speculate on why they have become such popular genres in the early 21st century. But as I did last Tuesday, I want to at least tip my hat to cooking. I did a little bit of Chinese cooking earlier in the week. I made a version of what in Chinese is called chow mein. In English, it's roughly transliterated as chow mein, which means fried noodles, and these are some noodles that I fried up with pork and some greens. Very nice. But I also had an idea later in the week to make a dish with spinach. I keep coming across spinach in the supermarket, and I keep buying it every time I see it. And I had an idea for eggs Florentine. Now, Florentine is typically the culinary word that means spinach, so that when you say chicken Florentine, you mean chicken with spinach. Eggs Florentine, eggs with spinach. And eggs Florentine is really a play on eggs Benedict. And here I want to just briefly get into chameleon cook mode and say, well, what are eggs Benedict? They are a base of a toasted English muffin with some ham on top of that, with a poached egg on top of that, and then hollandaise sauce smothered over everything. Well, break it down into the components. So you've got at the bottom some sort of bread, then something on top of that. It could be ham or bacon or cheese or spinach, and then on top of that an egg cooked some way, and then over it all some kind of sauce. When you break it down that way, you can have any kind of sauce you want. You can have your eggs cooked any way you want, fried, poached, scrambled, boiled maybe, have to be out of the shell, and spinach, ham, bacon, cheese, and on the bottom toast, English muffin, crumpet. Make your choice. So here is my eggs Florentine. I poached an egg with the spinach, and then I placed it on a toasted bun, half, spinach, poached egg, and béarnaise sauce on top of that. So that just gives you some idea for chameleon cooking for eggs Benedict. Typically a breakfast dish, I guess, but you could serve it at any time. I don't think of it as breakfast food. All right, that's my culinary fantasy. Now let's talk about literary and other forms of fantasy, particularly films and TV series. And the reason I got thinking about fantasy was not because of the prevalence of fantasy in English cinema, or English-speaking cinema, I should say, with the likes of C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, you know, the Narnia series, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and then the various franchises going back to the 70s of Star Trek, Star Wars, which is still extremely popular, Harry Potter, and on and on. There's all of those going on, but what got me thinking about it was my Netflix account, because I live in Cambodia, is heavily dominated by Korean movies and Korean TV. I think about easily 60% is Korean stuff. Fortunately, subtitles, because I don't speak Korean. And I started watching these TV series that turned out to be sort of a blend of Korean history and fantasy, and the fantasy had to do with the spirit world. That people who were not humans, I mean the characters who were not human, but they appeared in human form because they had been human at some point, but instead of dying and being reincarnated, they had been, for some reason, punished by being returned to Earth and made to do some kind of penalty. One of the first ones I watched was called Mystic Pop-Ups Bar, which is, I think, a really kind of fun kind of romp around the way Koreans see their own history, going back to the Joseon period, who the Grim Reaper is, who comes for people who are dead, where they go, if they're reincarnated, or if they are consigned to hell or whatever, and various other spirit characters. That intrigued me. Then there were several others, one called The Guardian, one called Sun Embracing Moon, I think. I don't know, all the English titles don't really translate the Korean titles very well. And I just noticed that there are just so very many of them. And most of them are not particularly good. But some of them are particularly entertaining. And it reminded me of genres, certainly that I used to be aware of as a teenager, particularly in book form. I mean, I knew the Tales of Narnia, I knew C.S. Lewis, I knew Lord of the Rings even from sixth form days. And as it happens, J.R.R. Tolkien was a member of the senior common room at my college at Pembroke, because he had been the professor of Anglo-Saxon there. So I was aware of the books. I've never really watched many movies. Like Harry Potter doesn't. I've never read any Harry Potter books, and I've only seen maybe one of the movies on a flight, and I didn't have many choices on my particular flight. So at one time, I will say that I was interested in Star Trek when it first came out, and I was in college, and I did watch a few, not many, but I was aware of it. And Star Wars, I saw the first three movies, because I saw the first movie and I thought it was really pretty good. I was a graduate student at the time, and all of my friends thought it was fun, although they thought the ending of the first one was kind of dopey. But then the second and the third one I watched, and then after that, not interested. Can't get involved in it. But they're getting bigger and bigger and more popular. More complex graphics, storylines getting more involuted and twisted and so forth. And I'm wondering, like, what is this all about? Why are people so fixated on realities, plural, that are not real, that are demonstrably false? And whether it be United States and United Kingdom versions of unreal realities or Asian versions, why have they become so enduringly popular and make a lot of money?
Well, I would hesitate to give a simple answer to a question that has some complex layers to it, because the genres of fantasy and science fiction are quite broad and they cover quite different territory. For example, if you think about Korean, like these historical fantasies, they don't really require much in the way of special effects, virtually none. Whereas as the years have progressed, space exploration has gone from being something pretty crude in terms of effects to enormously powerful computer graphics. And Star Trek, great example, where most of the sets were in the let's say the early 70s were really I mean, they looked like they were made from cardboard, painted cardboard. And when they were on board the Enterprise and it got hit, I mean, you could tell that the camera was shaking a little bit, and all of the actors were just throwing themselves about to imitate the shaking of the Enterprise. And of course now it's enormously more high tech. So, one of the answers could be that certain genres, sci-fi genres, are increasingly popular because the effects are in themselves seductive, that you can go to a movie and just be blown away by all of the effects. But that's not really the whole story by any means. As I said, because the Korean fantasy dramas have virtually no effects in them whatsoever, and they're still very popular. They invoke worlds that are, I guess, part of a certain kind of religious tradition, like the concept of reincarnation, where you might be reincarnated as somebody highborn, somebody lowborn, an animal, an insect, all dependent on what you have done in this world. And there being various supernatural beings, including a kind of godhead, and then various other supernatural beings who control the reincarnation, what happens, or who control hell. And the thing that I keep returning to is the question of the underlying
purpose of each of these TV series or movies. And in some ways it's really, really simple to the point of being childish, which is that they all are battles between good and evil, and in the end, after a great complex struggle, good wins. Now that's been knocking around as an underlying idea in drama for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's not the only one. It's a version of what Nietzsche and earlier philosophers would call comedy. The comedy is a form in which things are confused, chaotic, warring, whatever, and in the end order prevails, and in like Shakespearean drama, for example, in the Shakespearean comedies, in the end everyone gets married and has presumably children and a happy life. But there's also tragedy, and tragedy is a genre in which things fall apart. The tragic hero has a tragic flaw. You know, Hamlet is indecisive, Othello is jealous, and so forth. Macbeth is ambitious, and this flaw grows and grows and grows until the hero dies, by his own hand or her own hand, or by fate or whatever. And the final scene, I mean, you think about the final scene in Hamlet, like everyone's dead. The king's dead, the queen's dead, Hamlet's dead, Laertes is dead. They're all lying dead. Romeo and Juliet die. You know, Othello dies, Macbeth dies, and Elizabethan audiences would get to the end and say, "Wow, that was great." You know, my favorite hero died. Yes. And we don't do that anymore. Why don't we? Why do we have this battle between black and white, you know, evil and good? And why do we insist always that good triumphs over evil? And why do we place that battle, which has been placed for centuries in various genres, in literary genres in particular, why do we now insist on having all this dramatic effects and computer graphics and so forth, only to have good triumph in the end? Now, I again can't give you a simplistic answer. I would say that trope, or that metaphor of life, is certainly satisfying to us, probably in an escapist way, because it's not real. Like, it doesn't happen in real life. Really horrible people prosper. Corruption is rampant in many countries, and the corrupt win. Corrupt politicians control many countries in the world and make them miserable for people, and their lives go on being miserable day after day after day. People live in horrible marriages. People are poor. People have really awful jobs that are boring, and they can't wait for the weekend or for vacation because they're horrible. That people's lives, the more problematic people's lives are, then the more they're likely to want to escape to something other than that,
so that they can have a fantasy of what could make their lives better. I mean, that would be a relatively simple hypothesis. And incidentally, is also one of the hypotheses that explains the rampant use of various drugs, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, but also alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and so forth. These are all other means of physical escape, and it seems to be particularly prevalent now. It's growing because there's a growing sense among people that life is not what we think it ought to be. I mean, there are also plenty of religious cults knocking around that believe that we're in what are called end times in Christian evangelical terminology. The Jehovah's Witness, for example, are an apocalyptic cult that believes that any day now Armageddon's going to happen and all of this terrible stuff is going to end. Well, those apocalyptic cults crop up century after century after century, and they are indicators that culture is not doing well, that people are not prospering within their cultures. So I would say, as a brief conclusion for now, and I will return to this, is that the rise of fantasy and sci-fi, particularly in movies, is a bad sign. It's a sign that people are not living lives that are satisfying to them, and they need or feel the need to escape. There are other ways that one could satisfy the itch that these various genres provide, including getting deeply involved in actual science, in astrophysics, for example. It's amazing things. I mean, just buy a telescope. That was one of the most amazing things that I ever bought when I was a lot younger. And I remember the day I first looked at the moon through a telescope, and it was just astounding. Because I'm so used to seeing this flat, two-dimensional disc, and you can actually see shadows and craters and things. And I looked at Mars and binary stars. Amazing. I mean, certainly not as amazing as computer graphics in the latest movie, but it's real. It's not a fantasy. So, to reiterate, I think that the rise of fantasy and science fiction is a very bad sign. And I don't have any solutions. I'm not a cultural engineer, but it's a warning that we are in not necessarily end times, but we are in bad times. So, to be continued. And meanwhile, please tell your friends. I would like a few more viewers, if I could get them. Tell them about my videos and ask them to subscribe. And I will return on Friday with a new episode.